The photograph was found in the autumn of 2019, tucked between the rotted floorboards of a farmhouse that had stood abandoned for nearly 7 decades in the hills of McDowell County, West Virginia. The house belonged to no one anymore. Its last known occupant, a woman named Edna Coulter, had died in 1952, leaving behind no heirs, no will, and no explanation for the locked room on the second floor that neighbors claimed she never once entered in 40 years of residence. When the county finally authorized demolition, a young archivist named Thomas Weaver was permitted to catalog whatever remained inside before the bulldozers arrived. He expected to find the usual debris of forgotten lives, moth-eaten quilts, rusted cookware, perhaps a family Bible with names scrawled in faded ink. What he found instead was something that would consume the next 4 years of his life and ultimately cost him his career, his marriage, and very nearly his sanity. Beneath the warped planks of the locked room's floor, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow resisted a century of moisture and decay, lay a single photograph. It measured approximately 8 by 10 inches, a formal portrait, professionally composed, bearing the faint watermark of a studio in Welch, West Virginia, dated 1894. The image depicted 2 young men, brothers by the unmistakable similarity of their features, seated side by side against a painted backdrop of alpine scenery that was fashionable in portrait studios of that era. They wore their Sunday best, dark wool suits, high starched collars, expressions of studied solemnity that the long exposure times of 19th century photography demanded. The brother on the left appeared to be in his early 20s. His jaw was square, his shoulders broad, his hands resting on his thighs with the calloused confidence of a man accustomed to physical labor. His eyes, even in the sepia tones of the aged print, conveyed something harder, a watchfulness perhaps, or a warning. The brother on the right was younger, softer in feature, with the kind of face that might have been called gentle in a different context. His posture curved slightly inward, as if he were instinctively making himself smaller. His hands were clasped in his lap, fingers interlocked so tightly that the tendons showed white even through the photograph's fading. But it was not the brothers themselves that made Thomas Weaver's breath catch in his throat that October afternoon. It was the shadow between them. In the narrow space separating the 2 seated figures, perhaps 18 inches of empty chair visible between their shoulders, there was a darkness that should not have existed. The studio's lighting had been arranged, as was standard practice, to eliminate shadows from the backdrop. The alpine scene behind the brothers was evenly illuminated, crisp and clear. Yet between them, occupying the space where only painted mountains should have been visible, there was a shape. It was not a casting shadow from either brother. The angle was wrong, the density too solid. It appeared to rise from the seat of the chair itself, extending upward to approximately the height of a human head, tapering at what might have been shoulders. Thomas Weaver was not a superstitious man. He had spent 15 years cataloging the detritus of Appalachian history, mining records, company store ledgers, photographs of cave-ins and Union riots, and families posed before tar paper shacks. He had seen 1,000 images of death and poverty and desperation without ever once believing he had glimpsed anything beyond the frame. But standing in that locked room, holding the photograph up to the gray light filtering through the single filthy window, he felt something he had never experienced in his professional life. He felt watched. The sensation was so immediate, so physical, that he actually turned to look behind him and found only the empty doorway, the dust motes suspended in the still air, the silence of a house that had been waiting 70 years for someone to finally look. Thomas Weaver photographed the room. He documented the position of the floorboard beneath which the portrait had been hidden. He noted the oilcloth wrapping, the absence of any accompanying documentation, the fact that the locked room contained nothing else, no furniture, no personal effects, only bare walls and a single window that had been nailed shut from the inside. Then he took the photograph to his supervisor at the McDowell County Historical Society and asked a question that would set everything in motion. Who were these men, and what is that shadow between them? The investigation that followed would eventually span 4 states, 7 archives, 3 exhumations, and 1 discovery so disturbing that the West Virginia State Police briefly considered reopening a case that had been closed for 123 years. But all of that lay ahead. In the beginning, there was only the photograph, the shadow, and the names that Thomas Weaver finally uncovered after 6 weeks of searching through birth records, census data, and the crumbling pages of newspapers that had served the coal fields of southern West Virginia in the final decade of the 19th century. The brothers were Ezra and Solomon Kincaid, born in 1870 and 1874 respectively, to a family that had farmed the same hollow in McDowell County since before the Civil War. Their father, Josiah Kincaid, was a man of local reputation, a lay preacher who conducted services in a one-room church he had built with his own hands, a farmer whose modest holdings were the envy of neighbors who worked harder for less, and according to at least one surviving account, a man whose temper was spoken of only in whispers and never directly to his face. Their mother, whose name appears in the records simply as M. Kincaid, died in 1882 under circumstances that were never officially explained. The death certificate, which Thomas Weaver located in the county archives, listed the cause as accident. No further details were recorded. No inquest was held. After her death, Josiah Kincaid raised his 2 sons alone. By all accounts, the brothers were inseparable throughout their childhood and youth. They worked their father's land together, attended his church together, and were never seen apart in the small community that knew them. Yet the photograph from 1894, the only known image of either brother, tells a different story. Look at the space between them. Look at how carefully they have positioned themselves to create that gap, that emptiness, that perfect frame for whatever it is that rises from the chair between them. Look at the expression on Solomon's face, the younger brother, the softer one, and ask yourself what he is seeing that the camera somehow captured, but the photographer never noticed. Look at Ezra's hands, resting on his thighs with such deliberate stillness, as if he is afraid that any movement might disturb something that only he knows is there. And then ask the question that Thomas Weaver asked, standing in that locked room with the autumn light dying around him. What happened to the Kincaid brothers, and what did they bury between them? The answer would take years to uncover. It would require the excavation of graves that were never meant to be found, the deciphering of journals written in a code that had died with their author, and the testimony of descendants who had spent generations trying to forget what their ancestors had done. But the answer exists. It was always there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to finally look at the shadow and understand what it meant. This is the story of Ezra and Solomon Kincaid, 2 brothers bound by blood, separated by guilt, and united forever by a secret that neither could carry alone. It is a story about what happens when love becomes complicity, when silence becomes a kind of murder, and when the thing you cannot speak of begins to grow in the spaces you leave empty. It is a story that begins with a photograph and ends with the truth. And the truth, as you will see, casts the longest shadow of all. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. If you believe that some stories are buried not by time, but by intention, and that the only justice for the voiceless is to finally let them be heard, then you belong here. Subscribe now, because what comes next demands witnesses. To understand what happened to the Kincaid brothers, you must first understand the world that made them. McDowell County, West Virginia, in the final decades of the 19th century, was a place suspended between 2 eras, the dying agrarian past and the industrial future that was already sending surveyors into the mountains to map the coal seams that would transform the region into one of the most productive and most dangerous mining districts in American history. In 1894, when the portrait was taken, the railroads had not yet reached the deepest hollows. The coal companies had not yet bought up the mineral rights that would eventually reduce independent farmers to wage laborers in their own backyards. The old ways persisted: subsistence farming, barter economies, communities so isolated that a trip to the county seat might require 2 days of travel through terrain that had changed little since the first settlers arrived a century before. The Kincaids lived in a hollow called Sweetwater, though the creek that gave it its name had been neither sweet nor full for as long as anyone could remember. The family's land, approximately 40 acres of bottomland and forested slope, had been in Kincaid hands since 1831, when Ezra and Solomon's grandfather, a Scots-Irish immigrant named Amos Kincaid, had claimed it through a combination of legal homesteading and strategic marriage to a woman whose father had arrived even earlier. By the time Josiah Kincaid inherited the farm in 1865, returning from Confederate service with a wound in his shoulder that would ache every winter for the rest of his life, the property was considered prosperous by the standards of the region. The bottomland grew corn and tobacco. The slopes sustained a herd of cattle that was larger than any other in the hollow. The house, a two-story structure of hand-hewn logs, later sided with clapboard, was the finest dwelling for miles in any direction. Josiah Kincaid married in 1868. His wife's name, according to the single surviving document that mentions her, was Martha. She came from a family in the neighboring county, people who were said to have been educated, perhaps even wealthy by Appalachian standards, before the war reduced them to the same subsistence as everyone else. There are no photographs of Martha Kincaid. No letters in her hand survive. No one recorded her maiden name, her appearance, or her disposition. She exists in history only as a series of absences, a name on a marriage certificate, an initial on a death record, and a grave in the Kincaid family plot that bears no headstone, only a depression in the earth where the soil has settled over more than a century. What is known is this: Martha Kincaid gave birth to Ezra in October of 1870. She gave birth to Solomon in March of 1874. And sometime between Solomon's birth and her death in 1882, she gave birth to at least one other child. This is where the historical record becomes unreliable. The census of 1880 lists the Kincaid household as containing 4 members: Josiah, Martha, Ezra, and Solomon. But a church record from the same year, discovered by Thomas Weaver in the archives of a Baptist congregation that had absorbed the remnants of Josiah Kincaid's independent ministry, lists 5 baptisms performed by Reverend Kincaid in the year 1878. 4 of those baptisms were for children of other families in the hollow. The 5th was for a child identified only as E. Kincaid infant, E. Kincaid. Not Ezra, who would have been 8 years old in 1878 and presumably long since baptized. Another child. A 3rd Kincaid. Someone who was present in 1878, but absent from the census 2 years later. Thomas Weaver spent 3 months trying to locate any other reference to this child. He searched birth records, death records, cemetery registries, church documents, family Bibles, and the personal papers of every family that had lived in Sweetwater Hollow during the relevant period. He found nothing. E. Kincaid appeared once, in a single baptismal record, and then vanished from history as completely as if the child had never existed. But the Kincaid family plot, when Thomas Weaver finally obtained permission to survey it in 2021, told a different story. The cemetery was located on a hillside above the ruins of the farmhouse, in a clearing that had been maintained by unknown hands long after the last Kincaid had departed. 8 graves were visible, marked by headstones that ranged from weathered limestone to simple fieldstones bearing only initials. Josiah Kincaid's grave was the largest, a granite monument inscribed with his name, dates 1842, 1901, and a biblical verse: "The Lord shall judge his people." Beside him lay the unmarked depression that Thomas Weaver believed to be Martha's grave. Ezra Kincaid's headstone was modest, but legible. Ezra Josiah Kincaid, 1870-1931, asleep in Jesus. Solomon Kincaid's grave lay at the far edge of the plot, separated from the others by a distance of approximately 15 feet. His headstone was the smallest, the inscription nearly erased by time: Solomon Kincaid, 1874-1894. The same year the photograph was taken. Thomas Weaver stood before that grave for a long time, doing the arithmetic that the dates demanded. Solomon Kincaid had died at 20 years old, the same year he sat for a portrait with his brother in a studio in Welch. But that was not what made Thomas Weaver's hands tremble as he surveyed the cemetery. What made his hands tremble was the 9th grave. It was located between Martha's unmarked depression and Solomon's isolated stone, a small rectangular plot, perhaps 3 feet in length, covered with a flat fieldstone that bore a single carved letter, E. Just the letter. Nothing else. No dates, no name, no verse. A child's grave. E. Kincaid, the infant baptized in 1878 and missing from the 1880 census. The 3rd Kincaid child, dead before the age of 2, buried in a grave that someone had gone to considerable effort to mark, while simultaneously ensuring that no one would ever know who lay beneath. Thomas Weaver photographed the grave. He measured its dimensions. He noted its position relative to the other plots and the angle of the fieldstone's carving. And then he made a decision that would change everything. He requested permission to conduct a ground-penetrating radar survey of the Kincaid family cemetery. What he found would not only explain the shadow in the photograph, but would rewrite the history of Sweetwater Hollow and the family that had shaped it for more than a century. The radar survey was conducted in September of 2021 under overcast skies that threatened rain but never delivered. The technology was straightforward: electromagnetic pulses sent into the ground, their reflections analyzed to reveal anomalies in the soil, coffins, vaults, any disturbance in the Earth's natural stratification. The 8 marked graves showed exactly what Thomas Weaver expected: rectangular anomalies at depths consistent with burials from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But the 9th grave, the child's grave, marked only with the letter E, showed something else. The anomaly was there, at the expected depth of approximately 3 feet. A small coffin, child-sized, exactly where the grave marker indicated. But the radar also detected a second anomaly. It was located approximately 18 inches below the first, directly beneath the child's coffin, and it was considerably larger. Adult-sized. Someone had dug a grave for a child and, before placing the small coffin in the earth, had buried an adult body at the bottom of the same hole. Thomas Weaver requested an exhumation order. The process took 14 months, during which time he was placed on administrative leave by the Historical Society, divorced by his wife, and threatened with legal action by 3 separate individuals who claimed distant kinship to the Kincaid family and objected to what they called the desecration of their ancestors' remains. But in November of 2022, with the authorization of a county judge and the supervision of a forensic anthropologist from West Virginia University, the grave marked E was finally opened. They found the child first. The small coffin had deteriorated to fragments, but the bones remained. The skeleton of an infant, sex indeterminate, age estimated at 12 to 18 months. The cause of death could not be determined from the remains. Then they dug deeper. 18 inches below, wrapped in what had once been a canvas shroud, lay the skeleton of a young woman. She was approximately 18 to 22 years of age at the time of death. Her bones showed evidence of multiple healed fractures, ribs, a cheekbone, the orbital socket of her left eye. Injuries consistent with repeated physical trauma over a period of years. Her skull showed evidence of a single catastrophic fracture to the posterior cranium. Someone had struck her from behind with tremendous force. The forensic anthropologist's report was unequivocal. This was not an accident. This was not disease. This woman had been beaten throughout her life and ultimately killed by a blow to the back of the head. And someone had buried her in secret, beneath the body of a dead child, in a grave that bore only a single letter to mark its location. The question was no longer what the shadow in the photograph represented. The question was, who was she? The identification of the woman buried beneath the child's grave took another 8 months and required the cooperation of forensic geneticists, genealogical researchers, and historians who specialized in the undocumented lives of Appalachian women in the 19th century. The DNA extracted from her bones was compared against samples provided by living descendants of families who had inhabited Sweetwater Hollow in the 1870s and 1880s. The match, when it came, was not what Thomas Weaver expected. The woman was not a stranger. She was not a traveler who had died passing through. She was not a victim of random violence buried in the Kincaid cemetery by coincidence. The woman buried beneath the child's grave was a Kincaid. Her DNA matched that of the infant buried above her with 99.7% probability. She was the child's mother. And her DNA showed markers consistent with being a close blood relative of both Ezra and Solomon Kincaid. The forensic geneticists delivered their conclusion with the caution that such determinations always require. Based on the genetic evidence, the most probable relationship between the woman and the 2 brothers was that of sibling. Sister. The Kincaid family had not had 2 sons. They had 2 sons and a daughter. Her name, Thomas Weaver would eventually discover, was Emmeline. He found it in the strangest of places, not in any official record, not in any church document, but in a letter that had been preserved for more than a century in the personal archives of a family that had left McDowell County in 1885 and never returned. The letter was written by a woman named Sarah Aldridge, addressed to her sister in Ohio, and dated March 12, 1879. It read, in part, "I saw the Kincaid girl at the store yesterday, the one they keep so close. Her name is Emmeline, though Josiah does not like for it to be spoken. She is near my own age, I think, perhaps 17 or 18, and pretty enough that you wonder why they hide her so. She did not speak to me, only looked at me with those eyes that seem to see everything and trust nothing. I would pity her if I did not fear her father more. Emmeline Kincaid, a daughter hidden from census takers, excluded from official records, kept so close that even neighbors in a community where everyone knew everyone's business were uncertain of her existence." Thomas Weaver searched for more. He found fragments, a reference in another letter to the Kincaid girl who died in childbed, a notation in a doctor's account book for services rendered to J. Kincaid, female patient, 1878. A single line in the diary of a traveling preacher who passed through Sweetwater Hollow in 1877. Visited Josiah Kincaid's farm, met his sons, fine boys, did not see the daughter, though I heard her coughing in the back room. A picture began to emerge. Emmeline Kincaid had been born sometime around 1860 or 1861, before her brothers, the eldest child of Josiah and Martha Kincaid. But unlike her brothers, she had not been raised in the open. She had not been baptized in her father's church. She had not been counted in censuses or recorded in the documents that preserved the lives of her siblings for posterity. She had been kept. The reasons for this concealment can only be inferred from the evidence that survives. But the patterns are consistent with cases documented throughout Appalachian history. Cases of daughters hidden because of physical deformity, mental illness, or the simple fact that their existence was inconvenient to fathers who valued sons and saw daughters as burdens to be minimized. What is clear is that by 1878, Emmeline Kincaid was pregnant. The father of her child was never identified in any surviving document, but the circumstances of her isolation, her invisibility, her existence within a household dominated by a man whose temper was spoken of only in whispers, these circumstances suggest possibilities that Thomas Weaver found almost too terrible to articulate in his final report. The child was born. It was baptized as E. Kincaid, infant, in the only official acknowledgement of either mother or child's existence. And then, sometime between that baptism and the census of 1880, both mother and child vanished. The census shows 4 Kincaids in the household: Josiah, Martha, Ezra, Solomon. The grave shows where the 5th and 6th went, but the grave does not explain everything. It does not explain why Emmeline was killed. The blow to her skull, the years of abuse written in her healed fractures. It does not explain why she was buried in secret beneath her own dead child in a grave that bore only the initial of a name that was forbidden to be spoken. It does not explain what happened to Martha Kincaid, who died in 1882 of an accident that was never investigated. And it does not explain the shadow in the photograph. For that explanation, Thomas Weaver had to turn to the only source that remained: the private writings of the Kincaid brothers themselves. Ezra Kincaid's journal was found in 2023 during the demolition of a barn that had once belonged to a neighboring family. It had been hidden in a false-bottomed feed bin, wrapped in the same oilcloth that had protected the photograph, preserved by the same care that suggested someone had wanted these words to survive, even as they ensured no one would easily find them. The journal spans the years 1888 to 1894. Its entries are sporadic, sometimes separated by months, written in a cramped hand that becomes increasingly difficult to read as the years progress. The early entries deal with the mundane concerns of farm life, weather, crops, the health of livestock. But beginning in 1891, the tone shifts. An entry dated April 3, 1891 reads, "Solomon will not speak of it. Says he has forgotten, but I see him looking at the place where the grave is. I see him counting the years. He has not forgotten. Neither have I. Neither has she." An entry from October 1892. dreamed of Emmeline again. She was standing in the doorway of the back room, holding the child, looking at me the way she looked at me that night. I woke and could not breathe. Solomon was awake too. He does not sleep through the night anymore. None of us do. And an entry from January 1894, 3 months before the photograph was taken. Father is dying. The doctor says it will not be long. Solomon says we should tell someone before he goes. I told him there is no one to tell. What would we say? What would we confess? We were children. We did what we were told. We held the lantern. We dug where he pointed. We did not ask what was in the canvas. We did not look. But we knew. We have always known. And now she stands between us, every day, every night, in every room of this house and every corner of this land. She stands where we put her, and she will not let us forget. The journal does not describe the murder directly. Ezra Kincaid never wrote the words that would have confirmed what happened in that farmhouse in 1878 or 1879, but the fragments tell their own story. 2 boys, Ezra, 8 or 9 years old, Solomon, 4 or 5, woken in the night by their father. A lantern pressed into small hands. A walk to the hillside cemetery in the dark. A hole already dug. A canvas bundle that was not to be looked at, not to be questioned, not to be spoken of ever again. Their sister, wrapped in canvas. Their niece, or perhaps given the circumstances of Emmeline's concealment, their half-sibling, buried first, the small coffin that would serve as cover for what lay beneath. And then the years of silence, the father who continued to preach on Sundays about sin and redemption, the mother who died 4 years later under circumstances that were never explained. The 2 sons who grew to manhood in a house built on a grave they could not forget, and a truth they could not speak. This is the moment where I ask you to pause. If this story has reached you, if you feel the weight of what these brothers carried, then I invite you to leave a comment with a single sentence. Some secrets bury the living more than the dead. Write it now. Let me know you understand what silence costs. The photograph was taken on March 15, 1894. Thomas Weaver was able to determine the exact date through a combination of studio records. The photographer, a man named Hiram Faust, had kept meticulous logs of every portrait he made, and the internal evidence of Ezra Kincaid's journal. The entry for that date reads, "We went to Welch today. Solomon said it was necessary. He said we needed proof that we existed, that we were brothers, that we were real. I do not know what he means by real. I have never felt less real in my life. I feel like a photograph already, an image of something that used to be a man." The studio was small. The photographer positioned us on a bench. He said to hold still. He said the exposure would take 40 seconds. He said not to move. I did not move. Solomon did not move. But something moved between us. I felt it when the plate was exposed. A coldness, a presence, something filling the space we had left empty. The photographer did not seem to notice. He was behind his camera, counting seconds, watching his clock. When it was done, he said the portrait would be ready in a week. I do not want to see it. I already know what it will show. The portrait was collected on March 22, 1894. The photographer's log indicates that the bill, $3 for a single print, was paid in cash by E. Kincaid. There is no record of what Ezra Kincaid thought when he first saw the image. His journal contains no entry for that date or for the 2 weeks that followed. But on April 8, 1894, he wrote, "Solomon has seen it. He took it from my room while I was in the fields. I found him in the barn, holding it, staring at the space between us. He was weeping. I have not seen my brother weep since we were children. He said, 'She is there. She has always been there. And now everyone can see.' I told him no one can see. It is a shadow, a trick of the light, an imperfection in the plate. But we both know that is not true. She is there. She has been there since that night, standing in the space we cannot fill, holding the child we could not save. She will be there until we confess, and we cannot confess. Father made us swear. Mother made us swear. And now they are both gone, and we are the only ones left who know. We are the only ones left who remember her name. The question that haunted Thomas Weaver was not whether something appeared in the photograph. The shadow is visible, documented, analyzed by experts who have offered explanations ranging from double exposure to chemical degradation of the original plate. The question was why the brothers kept it. If the shadow disturbed them, if it represented, as Ezra's journal suggests, the sister they had helped bury and the guilt they could not escape, why not destroy the portrait? Why not burn it, tear it, bury it alongside the secret it seemed to expose? Instead, they preserved it. They wrapped it in oilcloth. They hid it beneath the floorboards of a room that would remain locked for the next century. They ensured that it would survive them, survive the house, survive everyone who had known the truth of what happened in Sweetwater Hollow. They left it for someone to find. The answer, Thomas Weaver came to believe, lay in the final entries of Ezra Kincaid's journal, entries written in the weeks after Solomon's death. Solomon Kincaid died on September 3, 1894, 6 months after the photograph was taken. The cause of death listed on his certificate was drowning. He was found in the creek that ran through the family property, in water that was, at its deepest point, less than 3 feet. The coroner's report, which Thomas Weaver located in the county archives, noted several unusual features of the death. Solomon's lungs contained creek water consistent with drowning, but his body also showed evidence of fresh abrasions on his palms and knees, injuries consistent with crawling, with struggling to rise, with fighting against something that held him down. The coroner concluded that Solomon had likely fallen, struck his head, and drowned while unconscious. But Ezra Kincaid's journal suggests a different interpretation. The entry dated September 5, 1894, 2 days after his brother's death, reads, "They have taken Solomon's body. The funeral will be Thursday. Father Brennan from Welch will conduct the service. There will be prayers. There will be hymns. There will be a burial in the plot beside the others. Not beside her. I have asked that he be placed at the edge, away from the place where she lies. He would not want to be near it. He was always the one who could not bear to walk past that grave. He was always the one who heard her at night. I did not hear her. I trained myself not to hear. But Solomon, gentle Solomon, soft Solomon, the one who was too young to understand what we were doing that night but old enough to never forget, he heard her always. He said she called his name. He said she asked him why. Why did we help? Why did we not tell? Why did we let Father put her in the ground while we held the lantern and watched? I had no answer. There is no answer. We were children. We did what we were told. But Solomon could not accept that. He could not live with what we had done, and now he does not have to. The entry continues on the following page, in handwriting that has become nearly illegible with emotion. I found him at dawn. He was face down in the creek, in the shallows where we used to play as boys. His hands were buried in the mud. His knees were scraped raw. He had been crawling toward the bank, toward the hill, toward the cemetery, toward her. I believe he went to confess. I believe he went to finally speak her name aloud, to acknowledge what we had done, to ask her forgiveness. I believe he went to end the silence that had been killing him for 16 years. And I believe she answered. I believe she held him there, in that water, until he understood that there is no forgiveness for what was done to her. There is no confession that can undo a buried truth. There is no atonement that brings the dead back to life. There is only memory. There is only the weight of what we carry. There is only the shadow that stands between us and follows us and waits. She is waiting still. I feel her now as I write these words. She is in this room with me, standing in the corner where the lamplight does not reach. She is holding the child. She is looking at me with those eyes that see everything and trust nothing. She is asking me what I will do now that Solomon is gone. I do not know what to tell her. I do not know what remains. Ezra Kincaid did not die in 1894. Unlike his brother, he lived for another 37 years, dying in 1931 at the age of 61. His death certificate lists the cause as heart failure. But those 37 years were not years of peace. According to the fragments of evidence that survive, property records, occasional mentions in local newspapers, the memories preserved in the oral histories of families who remained in the region, Ezra Kincaid became a recluse after his brother's death. He never married. He never had children. He sold off most of the family land piece by piece, keeping only the house and the hillside cemetery. He stopped attending church. He stopped speaking to neighbors. He became, in the words of one account, a ghost while still living. The house fell into disrepair around him. The fields returned to forest. The barn collapsed. The only structure he maintained was the cemetery, the graves on the hillside, the plots where his parents and his brother lay, the unmarked depression where his sister had been hidden for decades. When he died in 1931, the house passed to a distant cousin, Edna Coulter, whose maiden name was Kincaid, and who was the granddaughter of one of Josiah Kincaid's brothers who had left the region before the Civil War. Edna Coulter visited the property once after inheriting it. According to family stories passed down through her line, she spent a single night in the house, left at dawn, and never returned. She did not explain why. She did not tell anyone what she had seen or heard or felt in those hours of darkness. But she locked the room on the second floor, the room beneath which her cousin Ezra had hidden the photograph, and she never opened it again. She left instructions in her will that the house should not be sold, should not be occupied, should simply be left to stand until it could stand no longer. She died in 1952, taking whatever she knew with her, and the photograph waited beneath the floorboards for another 67 years, until Thomas Weaver pulled it from the darkness and looked at the shadow between two brothers who had carried their sister's memory into eternity. The forensic investigation of the Kincaid case concluded in early 2024. The remains of Emmeline Kincaid and her child were reinterred in the family cemetery, this time in a grave properly marked with her full name and the dates that could be determined from the evidence. Emmeline Kincaid, circa 1860-1879, an infant child. The cause of death was officially listed as homicide by person or persons unknown. No charges could be filed. Josiah Kincaid, the most likely perpetrator based on the circumstantial evidence, had been dead for more than a century. Martha Kincaid, whose role in her daughter's concealment and death remains unclear, had preceded him. Ezra and Solomon, who had been children at the time, and whose participation had been compelled rather than voluntary, had followed their parents into the grave. There was no one left to prosecute. There was no one left to punish. There was only the truth, finally spoken aloud after 145 years of silence. But the truth, Thomas Weaver discovered, has its own consequences. The publication of his findings in a regional historical journal in the spring of 2024 sparked immediate controversy. Descendants of families connected to the Kincaids, some of whom had participated in the cover-up either actively or through deliberate ignorance, came forward to dispute his conclusions. They argued that the forensic evidence was inconclusive. They argued that the journal entries were subject to interpretation. They argued that Thomas Weaver had constructed a narrative of murder and complicity from fragments that could just as easily support innocent explanations. A daughter hidden because of illness or disability. A death in childbirth that was concealed out of shame rather than guilt. A burial that was unusual only because the family was poor and the times were hard. These arguments were made in letters to editors, in posts on genealogical forums, in private threats that Thomas Weaver received in the months following publication. But the arguments could not explain the fractures, the healed breaks in Emmeline Kincaid's ribs, her cheekbone, her eye socket. The evidence of years of abuse, documented in bone, irrefutable, and permanent. They could not explain why a woman would be beaten throughout her life and then buried in secret beneath her own dead child. They could not explain the shadow in the photograph. Thomas Weaver resigned from the McDowell County Historical Society in June of 2024. His official reason was personal: the divorce, the years of obsessive research, the toll that the investigation had taken on his health and his relationships. But in a letter he wrote to a colleague, preserved in the files that would eventually be donated to the West Virginia State Archives, he offered a different explanation. I cannot continue this work because I have learned something that I cannot unlearn. I have learned that the past is not dead. It is not even past. It lives in the spaces we leave empty, in the questions we refuse to ask, in the names we forbid ourselves to speak. Emmeline Kincaid was erased from history by the people who should have protected her. Her own family hid her, abused her, killed her, and buried her in an unmarked grave. Her own brothers helped dig that grave and spent the rest of their lives haunted by what they had done. And yet her story survived. It waited beneath the floorboards, in the bones, in the shadow that would not be explained away. It waited for someone to finally look. I looked, and now I cannot stop seeing. I see her in every photograph from that era, in every family portrait, every group shot, every image of brothers and sisters standing stiff before painted backdrops. I find myself looking for the spaces between them, looking for the shadows, looking for the evidence of who has been erased, who has been hidden, who has been buried alive in the archives of their own families. Emmeline Kincaid was not unique. That is the horror of it. That is the truth I cannot escape. She was one of thousands, tens of thousands, of women and girls who vanished from history because their existence was inconvenient, because their stories were shameful, because the men who controlled the records decided that some lives were not worth documenting. I cannot save them. I cannot find them all. I cannot speak all of their names. But I can speak hers. Emmeline Kincaid, born circa 1860, died 1879, mother of a child whose name was never recorded, daughter, sister, human being, erased by history, remembered now. The photograph currently resides in the collection of the West Virginia State Archives, cataloged as item 2024.037-001. Portrait of Ezra and Solomon Kincaid, 1894, with unexplained optical anomaly. The description does not mention Emmeline. It does not mention murder. It does not mention the grave beneath the grave or the bones that were finally given a name after more than a century of silence. The archives, like history itself, require proof. They require documentation. They require evidence that meets standards established by committees and approved by institutions. The shadow between the brothers does not meet those standards. It is classified as an anomaly, an unexplained artifact of the photographic process, a curiosity worthy of note but not of interpretation. And perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps the truth of what happened in Sweetwater Hollow will always exist in the spaces between what can be proven and what can only be felt. Perhaps Emmeline Kincaid will always be a shadow, visible to those who know how to look, invisible to those who prefer not to see. But the photograph remains. The bones have been named, and somewhere in the hills of McDowell County, on a hillside where 8 graves, now 9, overlook the ruins of a house that kept its secrets for more than a century, the earth has finally been allowed to confess. There is one final piece of evidence that Thomas Weaver chose not to include in his published account of the Kincaid case. He mentioned it only once, in a letter to the colleague who would later donate his papers to the state archives. Even there, he approached it obliquely, as if he were afraid that writing the words directly would give them a power he could not control. The letter reads, "I need to tell you something that I have not told anyone else. I am telling you because I need someone to know, and because I am no longer certain that I trust my own judgment. When I first found the photograph, when I held it up to the light in that locked room and felt something watching me, I dismissed the sensation as imagination. The stress of the work, the isolation of the place, the natural tendency of the human mind to find patterns and presences where none exist. But the sensation did not go away. It followed me, through the years of research, through the exhumation, through the identification of the remains. Every time I looked at the photograph, and I looked at it hundreds of times, studying the shadow, analyzing the composition, searching for some rational explanation, I felt it. Something watching, something waiting, something that wanted to be seen. I told myself it was Emmeline. I told myself that her spirit, if such things exist, had attached itself to the image that proved her brothers had never forgotten her. I told myself that whatever I was feeling was a kind of gratitude, the presence of a woman who had been silenced for a century and was finally being heard. But that is not what it felt like. It did not feel like gratitude. It did not feel like relief or release or any of the emotions we attribute to the restless dead who have finally been laid to rest. It felt like hunger. I know how that sounds. I know that I am supposed to be a scholar, a rationalist, a man who deals in evidence and documentation rather than superstition. I know that everything I have just written undermines the credibility of the work I have spent 4 years completing. But I need you to understand why I have stopped. I have stopped because I am afraid. I am afraid of what I have woken up. I am afraid of what I have invited into my life by pulling that photograph from the darkness. I am afraid that Emmeline Kincaid, or whatever remains of her, whatever has been waiting in that shadow for more than a century, is not satisfied. She wanted to be found. She wanted to be named. She wanted her story to be told. But she also wants something else, something I cannot give her. Something that has to do with the men who hurt her, the father who killed her, the brothers who buried her, all of them long dead, beyond any justice I could provide. She wants them to know what she felt. She wants them to experience what she experienced. She wants the suffering she endured to be understood, not just documented. And since they are gone, since Josiah and Martha and Ezra and Solomon have all escaped into death, I believe she has settled for the next best thing. She has settled for me. I am the one who knows her story now. I am the one who carries her memory. I am the one who lies awake at night, imagining what it was like to be hidden and beaten and killed and buried in the cold ground with only an infant for company. I am the one who stands in her place. And I am afraid that is exactly what she wanted all along. Thomas Weaver died on October 14, 2024, 7 months after resigning from the Historical Society. The cause of death was listed as a fall. He was found at the bottom of a staircase in his apartment with injuries consistent with having tumbled from the top. The medical examiner noted no evidence of foul play, no indication of intoxication, no apparent reason for a healthy 52-year-old man to lose his balance on stairs he had climbed thousands of times before. The case was closed as an accident. But among his personal effects, cataloged by the police and later transferred to the state archives along with his research materials, was a single photograph. It was the portrait of Ezra and Solomon Kincaid, dated 1894. Thomas Weaver had somehow acquired it from the archives where it was supposed to be held. There is no record of him checking it out, no documentation of a loan or transfer. It was simply there, in his apartment, lying face up on the floor beside his body. The responding officer noted in his report that the photograph appeared to have been recently handled. There were fingerprints on the surface, Thomas Weaver's prints confirmed by comparison, concentrated around the edges of the image, as if he had been holding it up to examine it closely. The officer also noted something that he described as a trick of the light, but chose to include in his report nonetheless. The photograph depicts 2 men seated side by side. Between them is a dark area that appears to be a shadow or defect in the image. When viewed from certain angles, this shadow seems to extend beyond the borders of the photograph itself, as if reaching toward the viewer. This effect is presumably caused by the curvature of the paper or the lighting in the apartment. However, the undersigned found the visual effect unsettling and has noted it here for the record. The photograph has since been returned to the West Virginia State Archives. It sits in a climate-controlled vault, preserved in acid-free housing, available for viewing by researchers who submit the appropriate request forms and demonstrate a legitimate scholarly interest in 19th-century Appalachian history. Few people request to see it. The catalog description is dry, technical, unremarkable. The story of the Kincaid family, even in its sanitized, officially documented version, is known only to specialists in regional history. Emmeline Kincaid has her grave marker now. Her name has been spoken, her story has been told. But if you visit the archives and ask to see item 2024-2037.001, if you hold the photograph up to the light and look at the space between the 2 brothers, You may notice something that the official description does not mention. The shadow is not static. Over the decades, archivists have noted that the anomaly seems to shift position slightly from one viewing to the next. The effect is subtle, measurable only in millimeters, attributable to any number of causes: expansion and contraction of the paper, variations in lighting, the imprecision of human observation. But there is a pattern. In the earliest photographs of the portrait, images taken for documentation purposes in 2019 when it was first discovered, the shadow appears to occupy the exact center of the space between the brothers, equidistant from each. In photographs taken in 2022, after the exhumation, the shadow has shifted slightly toward Ezra, the older brother, the one who wrote in his journal about the guilt he could not escape. In photographs taken in 2024, after Thomas Weaver's death, the shadow has shifted again. It is no longer between the brothers. It is in front of them. It has moved to the foreground of the image, positioned at the very edge of the frame, as if whatever cast it has stepped forward from the backdrop and is now standing just outside the photograph's border, as if it is preparing to step through. This is where the official record ends. What remains is speculation, interpretation, the kind of narrative construction that historians are supposed to avoid, but human beings cannot help but perform. We want the story to mean something. We want Emmeline Kincaid's suffering to have a purpose, her brother's guilt to have a resolution, the shadow in the photograph to be explicable by the laws of physics and optics that govern the observable world. But some stories resist meaning. Some secrets refuse to stay buried. Some shadows grow longer with time instead of fading into the light. The Kincaid brothers carried their sister's memory for their entire lives. They built their existence around the space she occupied, the space between them, the gap they could not fill, the presence they could not acknowledge and could not forget. And when they finally sat for a portrait in a studio in Welch, West Virginia, in the spring of 1894, something in that space made itself visible. Call it a flaw in the emulsion. Call it a trick of the light. Call it the optical manifestation of guilt, the visible form of a secret that had grown too heavy to hide. Or call it by her name. Emmeline. The third Kincaid child. The hidden daughter. The erased sister. The shadow that stands between the living and the dead, waiting for the truth to finally set her free. She is still waiting. Look at the photograph. Look at the space between them. And ask yourself what you see. If you have watched this far, it is because you understand that some stories are not meant to entertain. They are meant to remember. Some truths are not found in archives, but in the spaces that history leaves empty. Some names are not spoken aloud until someone finally has the courage to listen for them in the silence. Emmeline Kincaid was erased for 145 years. She is not erased anymore. If this story has moved you, if you have felt the weight of what was buried and the cost of what was kept hidden, then do 3 things for her and for me and for yourself. First, if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, do so now. Not because I ask, but because stories like this one deserve to be heard. The forgotten need witnesses. Be one of them. Second, leave a comment that says, "I've watched this far. Let me know that you made it to the end." Let me see who truly understands that some things cannot be unseen, and some names, once spoken, can never again be silenced. Third, share this story, not for algorithms, not for numbers, but because somewhere, right now, there is someone who needs to hear it. Someone who carries their own hidden truth. Someone who looks at family photographs and wonders about the spaces between the smiles. Someone who knows what it means to be erased and is waiting for the courage to finally be seen. Like this video if it meant something to you. Share it if you believe that memory is a form of justice. And return when the next story calls you. Because there are always more names waiting to be spoken, more shadows waiting to be illuminated, more graves that have not yet given up their secrets. Until then, remember Emmeline. Remember what silence costs, and look carefully at the spaces in your own history, because the truth, when it is ready, will make itself known.